Guys, welcome back. I've got Whitney Reese again with me, and what we're talking about is a part two, if you will, about movement. And we've got some really good questions that have come up in forums and directly to Whitney, direct messages, all that good stuff. And so she wanted to clarify a couple of points specifically around the differences between an open kinetic chain and an open feedback loop, and then give a couple of examples so that people can kind of take that information away and really have some good context when they're working on their own training or working with their coach. So, Whitney, can you do me a favor and can you explain what the two are and maybe some of what the differences are?
Sure. So an open kinetic chain is when the distal segment is not fixed on the ground.
What is a distal
So,
segment?
so a distal segment would be my foot or my hand.
Okay.
So an easy example for an open kinetic chain movement would be the difference between a squat and a sitting knee extension.
Hmm.
So they both involve knee flexion and extension. The closed kinetic chain version is the squat. My foot is fixed on the ground. Every movement I do, that foot stays planted where it is. In a open kinetic chain movement, if I'm sitting doing a knee extension machine, my bottom and my thigh stay still. They're fixed on the piece of equipment. And the thing that is moving is my tibia and my foot. They are moving through space. The reason they are important to know is the order that muscles fire in is different between a closed chain movement and an open kinetic chain movement. As a coach, if someone has had a shoulder injury, a open kinetic chain movement puts more load on the rotator cuff. It is more specific to loading the shoulder in an open kinetic chain movement. If I need to protect that tissue, a closed kinetic chain movement for the arm, meaning my hand is fixed and it is my body moving on my arm, takes the load off of my rotator cuff. So that's a component of why for CCP, for the assessment pieces, it starts with a front leaning rest, which is a closed kinetic chain endurance assessment, looking at the scapula and what their positional quality is before doing an open kinetic chain test, which is the dumbbell external rotation and the dumbbell power raise. Because if I see in a closed kinetic chain environment, they can't control their scapula and their shoulder, I know if I then have them do an open kinetic chain movement, it's too much load for the rotator cuff and the scapula.
Got it. And just for some additional context, Whitney is also a movement instructor for OPEX, and so she clearly is speaking to the coaching side of this thing for a hot second because a lot of coaches who are athletes are asking a lot of these questions. So keep the questions coming, by the way, because this gives us a lot of good content to talk about. Okay, so if that is open kinetic chain, what is an open feedback loop? And people can certainly, we'll link back to the original video and blog, but what is the open feedback loop and how does that differ from an open kinetic chain?
So an open feedback loop is purely looking at how human beings perform motor learning and motor control. So it does not look at recruitment patterns of tissues, for example. Instead, it looks at what is the central processing unit, so what is the brain or the movement control center, what are the instructions it sends to then execute a movement. So in an open loop system, it goes from the central process to the instructions to the movement. There's no input that comes back to the central processing unit to close the loop. So it literally is, I decide, I send instructions, I execute. That's it. It's just an open loop. So previously, the example that I gave for that is speed-based movements. Classically, for motor learning, that is movements that you cannot receive any input after you execute the movement. So majority of research has looked at that from the perspective of throwing and kicking, because once I release the implement, I have finished executing the movements. Once the ball is in the air, there is nothing I can do with my body to change the trajectory of the ball once I release it. So that's where the difference between a back squat came in for a closed loop feedback system, is as I'm performing that movement, I'm getting input the entire time I am performing the movement. So as I start bending my knee, which means I'm starting to execute those instructions, I get some input that goes back to my brain. And then my brain goes, yep, that's right. That's what I want to do. Keep going. And it sends more instructions. Or I start bending my knee. It says, nope, that's not going to go well. You should change something. And I change the instructions, and then I change my pattern. So for coaching and learning, when I have a client doing a closed loop movement, that could be a deadlift, it could be a back squat, it could be a front squat, it could be a dumbbell press. The movement allows me to then provide input to change the plan while they're doing it. So those are all of the movements where you see a band around someone, or using an earthquake bar to bombard the system with input while they're doing it. For sport, for skill, which is things like jumping, throwing, kicking, and speed-based movements, it occurs too fast for me to change the instructions mid-movement.
So in real world scenarios here, let's go back to open closed chain. When would you use an open chain movement versus a closed chain movement?
Okay, so an open chain movement I could use in a couple scenarios. One would be for someone that doesn't have the prerequisite training age, postural endurance, or strength to express power or absolute strength. So that would be one example. So if you were going to look at levels, you could call that a level 1 person. You could call it a novice or a beginner. Another scenario would be the person that actually has pain. So someone has shoulder pain. I might want to use a closed kinetic chain movement to decrease the demand specifically on the shoulder. There's a lot of external research in pain science for using closed kinetic chain, long endurance, isometrics to decrease pain. And
And
part of why
that would go back to the FLR, like a front leaning rest.
yes,
People might view that as a version of a plank, just for visual reasons for folks.
yes,
Okay, so you can use that, call it impact, call it uh, extra movement. It just takes pressure off of something like a rotator cuff.
yes. And the other thing that it does is it allows a closed loop environment to occur, so that in that closed kinetic chain position, you can bombard the system with extra input. So you could have a client in a front leaning rest in a closed kinetic chain position, which is less aggressive. And then you can tap their elbow, or you could put a band around their arm to then give them even more input. So they're both getting the benefit of a protected environment. and the benefit of more input for that closed loop system, which is why in rehab, a lot of movements are based on closed kinetic chain positions and closed loop system feedback.
Yep.
Where
Now I'm following.
is it that has bled over into health and fitness, that those things help improve fitness.
So let
And
me try and summarize for my layman brain here. Um, it You are taking closed chain to mean less extrinsic movement, potentially less pressure in a fixed environment. But then, and anybody who hasn't watched the first video, we'll link to it, but watch the first video, read the first blog, because a lot of it's on the closed loop environment. And you're adding closed loop inputs because that is the way that people have been studied to more effectively improve movement patterns over time. And so you're using
yes,
the two of those pieces essentially simultaneously. That's fair, right?
yes.
Perfect. Okay.
And the third reason that occurs is the process humans develop through from infancy into learning to walk. We start in a closed kinetic chain environment. So the way we figure out as infants, because our head proportionally it weighs way more relative to the rest of our body weight, the way we learn where we are in space, how to shift our body, how to control our shoulder and our hip, and how to even get up off the floor, we start in a crawling position, which means the hands are the part of the body fixed on the floor, and the feet are the part of the body fixed on the floor. We learn by doing that through trial and error until we then learn to get upright. Once we're upright and we learn to walk, our hands are no longer the fixed segment. They now are mostly in an open kinetic chain environment once we learn to walk. And that's why many movement-based systems, when you look at how to correct or help someone move better, that's why most of those systems bring people back down into a hand on the ground position.
Makes sense. That now makes sense from a principled standpoint to me. One of the other pieces that you mentioned to me offline that I think is relevant here is essentially trying to quantify or understand what good is, or numbers for good or bad movement. Can you go into that a little bit about how you would view good, bad, indifferent movement from a very, I don't know, a tangible standpoint of like, this is good, this is bad? Like, how would you view that?
Right. So that's the hard one. And the reason that it's the hard one is this conversation goes back to about 1950, technically 1954, which is when the US started researching movement-based testing criteria. So from a purely statistical standpoint, to say a test actually can confirm if something is or is not there, there has to be a gold standard to say, when I test it, I have a true positive, meaning it tests as positive when the condition is present. And if the condition is not present, it tests as negative. So that's called a true positive and a true negative. For research, there's a couple steps for determining if a test even helps answer a question like that. And the problem is those tests would mean, for example, for a squat, how do you set a gold standard to say a squat is good and a squat is bad. Because what I can't do, and this is where statistics does work, I can't take a sample of your blood to say a virus is present when it comes to a movement like the squat. So if I was going to design a brand new test for some brand new virus, first, I would have to have a way to say the virus is present, which means we grow it on an agar plate. We confirm it's there with a genetic test even. Okay, so if I have that test and I then develop a prevalence, how many people get this, once I have that test, I would then do a study to validate it tests positive when it's present and it tests negative when it is not present. I can't do that with a squat. So
Why can't you do that with the squat?
so I can't use an anatomical confirmation to say a squat is good and a squat is bad. So a blood test isn't going to tell me that. A genetic test isn't going to tell me that. A MRI isn't going to tell me that. MRIs, that's a whole other hot can of worms. Even for a rotator cuff tear, the gold standard for a rotator cuff tear is not an MRI. It is to take a scalpel, open the shoulder, and visually look, is it torn? So if we acknowledge that is the gold standard, I can't do that with a living human being. So anatomical, medical-based testing can't help me when it comes to movement patterns. So instead, the only way I can say it is good or it is bad is I have to then look at, can you achieve the task you are trying to do? Can you achieve it with multiple shaped implements of multiple loads and sizes? And does that show to be durable, meaning it presents with consistency again and again and again? And this is where health versus fitness, there is a gap in between. And every movement researcher agrees that the gap in between means we have to look at the function of the individual and the function of the task they are trying to do.
And does that go back to the concept of that is why inputs and the human understanding, if they are moving quote unquote better, is so important? Is because as a coach or a practitioner, you simply can't get down to the scalpel situation. Is that part of it?
Yes.
Okay.
That is part of it. And there's a few researchers that have tried to quantify and classify, how do we look at human movement? Like, what does it mean to be human? One of them is we manipulate things. So either we are moving something or something is moving us. And we have some type of locomotion. So we can move from point A to point B. Saying it's just because we're bipedal, meaning we walk on 2 feet, doesn't work, because that would mean any person that doesn't have 2 feet wouldn't be human on that definition. So you have to use locomotion. We can get point A to point B. The most applicable way to break down movement so far is a taxonomy called Gentile's taxonomy, which looks at all the motor abilities any living human being could do. And if we boil it down to the most simplistic list, what would that list be? So it's a very simplistic version, and it doesn't have things on it like balance. But I think we could both agree, as far as ability, balance is pretty important.
You imagine if you just couldn't balance ever?
Yeah,
Like,
there's a lot of things you couldn't do in
yeah.
life if you can't balance, but ironically, it's not on that list. So there's still some flaws in that. But back to the original question of what is good movement and what is not good movement. If you look at Gentile's taxonomy, the individuals that you're watching, that you then find yourself saying, man, that person just moves really well. And they can do it in like multiple settings. And they're the classic multiple sport professional athlete. When you look at Gentile's taxonomy for the movements and skills they are doing, there's repeating domains and skills across all of those sports that they're doing. So it might not be that they necessarily have mastered every single one of those sports. It is more likely that the essence of what that sport requires, that person has a bigger toolkit to spread out and pick tools across those sports.
And
So
therein
when you're,
lies, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so that's when you see a professional quarterback cross over into baseball. The essence of the skill has similar motor abilities and similar expressions of power, accuracy, and strength.
And therein lies why younger kids, younger athletes, it's so beneficial for them to play multiple sports. It's not because they get good at soccer. It's because they understand how to move and they train their body to be able to function in those different, playing fields, basically.
Yes, and that's the last piece for why, if a athlete is going to at a professional level cross over into another sport, there's a reason that occurs later in their career. It's because they have mastered learning how to learn a motor skill. And so they can take the learning process that they've already exposed themselves to and the abilities they have already mastered, and they can apply that process into a similar sport. So it looks like they're learning it faster, but that's simply because they have already mastered how to learn. So
Oh, man.
exposing kids to that is why it's important.
We got to stop right here, Whitney, but just take a
Okay.
note, and everybody else take a note. We need to do a conversation on what makes professional athletes professional. I think that would be
Oh, that's a good one.
fascinating. Yeah. So I really appreciate you coming on. It's always helpful to have context and for you to walk me through this thing so that I can try to wrap my head around it. And I think a lot of other people really appreciate it too. So appreciate it as always. And everybody, we will see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim.